1,000 ships flew his banner across 4 seas, and admirals of nations that had never once written his name in their histories paid tribute to sail unmolested through his waters, but they forget the storm it took to build it. They forget the man who was once thrown from a cliff with his hands bound and left to drown. To understand the empire, you must first understand the betrayal, and the betrayal began on a night when the sea itself seemed to be holding its breath. Kesteth Vale was the youngest of 3 sons born to the Sea King Aldrich Vale, ruler of the Salt Throne, and he had spent 22 years believing that blood meant something in a family that measured worth only in crowns. His 2 elder brothers, Roan and Draven, had never once let him forget his place in the line of succession, a distant third, a spare to the spare, useful only as a hostage or a bargaining chip should the kingdom ever need one. He remembered, with the particular clarity that only humiliation seems to preserve, the specific cruelties of his childhood Roan's habit of accidentally capsizing his practice boat during naval drills in front of the entire officer corps. Draven's genius for making every gift Kestith received seem like an accident of pity rather than affection. The 2 of them exchanging looks over his head at council meetings whenever he dared to voice an opinion, as though his very presence in the room were a joke they had grown tired of explaining to newcomers. Kestith had spent his boyhood trying, in the particular desperate way of youngest sons everywhere, to earn a place in his brother's regard that no amount of effort ever seemed to secure. He had studied the naval charts harder than either of them, had memorized the currents of the Salt Throne's coastal waters until the old navigation masters admitted, grudgingly, that his instinct for reading weather off the shape of distant clouds surpassed their own. None of it mattered. Roan and Draven had decided, long before Kestith was old enough to understand the decision had been made, that he existed only as a convenient shape to measure their own superiority against, and no display of competence would ever be permitted to threaten that arrangement. Their mother, Queen Maren, had died bringing Kestith into the world, a fact his brothers never let him forget either, delivered always with the same casual cruelty that made the accusation sting worse than any shouted insult could have. When their father's health began to fail in the cold months before Kestith's 23rd year, the brothers did not wait for a natural death to settle the matter of the crown. They forged a confession from Kestith's own hand, a document swearing he had conspired with a rival house to poison their father, and presented it to the dying king with tears in their eyes and daggers hidden in their sleeves. The forgery, Kestith would later learn, had been the work of a court scribe named Oswin, a nervous, indebted man who had copied Kestith's handwriting from years of shared correspondence, and who would, in a small and bitter irony Kestith did not discover until much later, eventually hang himself from guilt 2 years after the deed, unable to live with what his greed had helped set in motion. Aldrich Vale, half blind with fever and grief, believed his eldest sons over the youngest, and gave the order himself, in a rasping whisper that Kestith would hear replayed in his nightmares for years afterward. Cast him from the widow's cliff, and let the sea judge what the throne could not. They did not even grant him the mercy of a clean death. Roan and Draven bound his wrists behind his back with wet rope that would tighten as it dried, gagged him so his cries would not carry to the fishing villages below, and marched him at spear point to the edge of the black cliff that jutted out over the coldest, deepest stretch of water in the kingdom, a place sailors called the Widow's Maw, because so few bodies thrown there were ever found. Draven, the crueler of the 2, leaned close before the guards shoved him over the edge and told him, almost gently, that this was simply how the ocean sorted the worthy from the unworthy, and that Kestith, plainly, had always belonged to the unworthy. Roan, for his part, said nothing at all, which Kestith would come to understand in the long years of reflection that followed, was in its own way a crueler betrayal than anything Draven's poisoned tongue could manage the silence of a brother who could not even be bothered to justify what he was about to do. The guards themselves, Kestith noted even through the haze of his own terror, would not meet his eyes as they carried out the order. One young soldier, barely older than a boy, had visibly trembled as he tightened the last knot on the binding rope, and for one brief, absurd moment, Kestith had thought he glimpsed something like an apology in the boy's frightened glance before duty overrode whatever conscience remained in him. Kestith never learned that soldier's name, and never had cause to think of him again in the years that followed. But he would remember, in idle moments for the rest of his life, that small flicker of reluctant humanity amid so much calculated cruelty, a reminder that even his brother's betrayal had required the complicity of people who, on some level, knew exactly what they were doing. The fall itself lasted only seconds, but Kestith would remember every one of them with a clarity that never dulled the shriek of wind past his ears, the black water rushing up to meet him with the flat, indifferent violence of a closing door, the impact that drove the breath from his lungs before the cold even had a chance to finish the job. He went under fast, weighted by soaked wool and bound hands, and it was only pure animal instinct, some last desperate refusal buried deeper than conscious thought, that made him claw the tightening rope against a jagged rock formation on the way down, tearing his wrists raw but freeing them just as his lungs began to convulse for air they did not have. He surfaced retching seawater, barely conscious, in the middle of a current that should have dragged him under a second time and finished what his brother started. Instead, the current carried him. He drifted for what felt like an eternity but was likely no more than half a day, in and out of consciousness, salt water burning every open cut on his body before the current finally deposited him, half drowned and shaking uncontrollably, on the shore of an island so small and so far from any charted shipping lane that it did not appear on a single map in his father's entire royal archive. It was a spit of black volcanic rock and windswept dune grass barely a mile across, ringed by reefs sharp enough to gut any hull that came too close, which was, Kestith would later understand, the only reason it had never been claimed by anyone at all. The locals of the nearest mainland port, when he eventually learned of them, called it the Widow's Shoal, an unclaimed extension of the same cursed reputation that had named the cliff he'd been thrown from. And no sane captain brought a ship anywhere near its reefs without a very good reason. The first days were a blur of raw animal survival that Kestith in his old life would never have believed himself capable of enduring. He had grown up soft in the way only royalty could afford to be soft hands that had never known callous, a body that had never known true hunger, a mind that had never once had to solve the problem of where his next meal would come from, because meals had simply always appeared. That softness died fast on the Widow's Shoal. He ate raw shellfish pried from the reef with broken fingernails, cutting his palms bloody on barnacles, sharp as broken glass, retching half of what he managed to force down because his body did not yet know how to process food eaten without the luxury of preparation. He drank rainwater collected in the hollow of a broken boulder because every other source on the island ran brackish and foul. He slept in the lee of a rock formation, with nothing but torn, salt, stiffened clothing for warmth, shivering through nights so cold his teeth ached from the constant chattering, and more than once he woke, convinced he was already dead, that this endless gray cold was simply what waited on the other side of drowning. The nights were, in many ways, worse than the days. In daylight, there was at least the distraction of survival, the endless small tasks of finding food and water that occupied his hands and, mercifully, dulled the sharper edges of his thoughts. But at night, curled against cold stone with nothing to do but wait for dawn, his mind returned again and again to the cliff, to his father's rasping voice, to Draven's almost gentle cruelty as the guards prepared to throw him over. He found himself, in those early weeks, arguing with his brothers in his head, constructing elaborate speeches that might have changed their minds, rehearsing defenses to a trial that had never actually happened, and it was only slowly, over the grinding accumulation of days, that he came to understand how useless this exercise was. His brothers had not needed to be convinced of his innocence, because his innocence had never been the point. The throne was the point. He had simply been an obstacle in its path, and obstacles, in the arithmetic his family practiced, were removed rather than reasoned with. He counted the days by scratching lines into the black rock with a sharpened shell, the same grim arithmetic that any abandoned man eventually resorts to, a way of proving to himself that time still moved forward even when nothing else in his existence seemed to. He thought, during those first weeks, endlessly and uselessly, about his brothers' faces in the torchlight atop the cliff, about his father's rasping order, about the particular cruelty of being condemned not by an enemy but by the very blood that was supposed to protect him. The anger, when it came, was not hot. It was cold and patient, settling into his chest like ballast, something that would not burn away, but would instead simply sit there, waiting, gathering weight with every day he survived that he was not supposed to survive. The island itself, though barren, was not entirely without resources, and Kestith spent his second and third weeks methodically mapping every foot of it, a habit that surprised him even as he practiced it, some deeply buried instinct for order and control asserting itself against the chaos of his circumstances. He found a small colony of seabirds nesting on the island's western point, whose eggs, gathered carefully and sparingly so as not to provoke the birds into abandoning the site entirely, became a crucial supplement to his diet of raw shellfish. He found a shallow cave on the northern face, barely large enough to crawl into, that offered at least partial shelter from the worst of the coastal winds. And he spent the better part of a week hauling driftwood and loose stone to improve it into something resembling a proper shelter, his hands blistering and splitting in ways that reminded him, bitterly, of the soft royal palms he had once been so unthinkingly proud of. He also discovered, during that same period of exploration, a tidal cave on the island's eastern shore that flooded completely at high water and drained almost entirely at low tide, a natural feature he initially avoided out of simple caution, but would, in later years, adapt into one of the settlement's most valuable hidden assets, a place to conceal both goods and, on occasion, people from anyone who came looking with hostile intent. In those first weeks, though, it was simply one more feature on a map he was building entirely for the purpose of survival, a mental accounting of every resource the island offered that might mean the difference between living through the next month and joining the long list of men the widow's maw had already claimed. It was in the fourth week, while wading the tide pools at low water searching for anything edible, that Kestith first noticed the pearls. He almost dismissed them entirely. The oysters that clustered thick along the island's southern reef were, at first glance, nothing remarkable small, ugly, difficult to pry open with his crude tools, yielding barely enough meat to justify the effort of cracking their shells. But one evening, starving and frustrated after a poor low-tide harvest, he smashed open a particularly stubborn specimen against a flat rock in pure irritation, and something rolled free from the wreckage and caught the dying light in a way that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a pearl unlike any he had ever seen in his father's treasury, larger than a thumbnail, with a deep, shifting luster that ran from pale silver to a faint, impossible blue, depending on the angle of the light, as if the pearl itself remembered the color of deep water and refused to let it go. He did not know, in that first stunned moment, kneeling in the cold tide with the little sphere cradled in his torn palm, that he was looking at the first coin of an empire. He knew only that it was beautiful, and that beauty, on an island where nothing else offered comfort, felt like something worth understanding. He sat with that single pearl for the rest of the evening, turning it over and over in the firelight of his small, carefully hoarded blaze, and found himself, for the first time since the cliff, thinking not about his brothers, but about the reef itself, about what other secrets it might be holding, and what it might take to learn them properly. The brutal grind of learning to harvest what he came to call ghost pearls consumed the better part of a year, and it very nearly killed him more than once. The oysters that produced them clustered deepest along the southern reef, in water cold enough to steal the breath from his lungs within minutes, guarded by currents that had already claimed one of his early diving attempts, and nearly claimed him along with it, a riptide that dragged him a quarter-mile off the reef before he managed to fight his way back to shallow water, arriving on the black sand coughing blood-tinged foam. Certain for the second time in his life that the ocean had finally decided to finish what his brothers started. He lay on the sand for nearly an hour after that first near drowning, too exhausted even to crawl back to his shelter, staring up at a gray sky and genuinely, seriously considering whether the effort of continuing to survive was worth the pain of it. It was, in the end, a small and almost embarrassing thing that pulled him back from that edge, the simple, stubborn thought that Draven's silence atop the cliff deserved, at minimum, to one day be answered by something. He did not know yet what that something would be. He only knew that dying quietly on this beach would hand his brothers a victory they had not earned honestly, and some deep, wounded part of his pride refused to grant them that. He learned, through trial that cost him skin and blood and more than one near drowning, to read the tide tables by watching the behavior of the shorebirds, to time his dives to the narrow windows when the current slackened, to hold his breath in progressively longer intervals through weeks of deliberate, grueling practice until he could work the deep clusters for nearly 3 full minutes before his lungs began to burn. He built, out of necessity and no small amount of trial and error, a simple weighted line and basket system that let him mark productive sections of the reef and return to them methodically rather than searching blindly each time, a small piece of engineering that his old tutors, had they lived to see it, would scarcely have recognized in the prince who had once found geometry lessons unbearably tedious. There was a particular afternoon, some 4 months into his study of the reef, that Kestith would remember for the rest of his life as the moment his relationship with the water itself began to change. He had been diving for hours, exhausted and half frozen, and had surfaced from what he intended to be his final attempt of the day when he noticed, in the shifting light beneath the waves, the faint silhouette of a much larger cluster of oysters embedded deep in a crevice he had never before had the breath or the courage to reach. Something in him, not recklessness, he would insist later, but a kind of calculated hunger that had learned, through months of failure, exactly how far his own limits could be pushed, made him dive one more time, forcing his lungs past their usual threshold, fingers scrabbling against rock in the growing dark of the deep crevice until they closed around the largest cluster he had yet found. He surfaced gasping, vision swimming with spots, and vomited seawater onto the black sand before he even had the strength to celebrate what he'd found. That single reckless dive yielded 6 pearls, more than he had found in the previous 2 months combined, and taught him a lesson he never forgot, that the reef's greatest rewards lived exactly at the edge of what nearly killed him to reach, and that the discipline of the previous months had been necessary precisely so that he could recognize and survive the moment it made sense to push past it. He cut himself constantly on the reef's razor edges, and more than once a shallow wound left too long in the salt water swelled into something angrier, hot and red and threatening, forcing him to cauterize the worst of them with a shard of volcanic glass heated in his small, carefully hoarded fire, screaming into the wind where no one could hear him do it. He learned, through a fever that nearly killed him in his 6th month on the island, which of the island's sparse plants could be crushed into a poultice that fought infection, and which merely looked similar enough to be a fatal mistake, a lesson he learned only because he forced himself, half delirious, to test each one in small, controlled doses on his own already ruined hands rather than risk a larger wound with an untested remedy. He remembered almost nothing of the worst 3 days of that fever, only fragments the taste of bitter crushed leaves forced past cracked lips, the sound of his own voice muttering things he did not remember saying, a dream, or perhaps not entirely a dream, in which his mother, dead these many years, sat beside him on the cold stone and told him, in a voice he had almost forgotten, that veils did not drown quietly. He woke from that fever weak and hollow-eyed, but alive, and never afterward doubted that some part of that dream, however impossible, had carried him through. Not every ghost pearl oyster held a pearl at all. Most were empty, ordinary shellfish that simply happened to share the same reef, and Kesteth spent weeks refining his eye for the subtle signs that distinguished a pearl-bearing shell from a barren one. The faint, ridging pattern, the particular weight when lifted, details invisible to anyone who had not spent months learning to read the reef the way a scholar reads a book. He kept careful count, scratched alongside his day tally on the cave wall, of how many shells he opened against how many pearls he found, and slowly, methodically, improved his ratio from 1 pearl in every 40 shells to, by the end of that first brutal year, nearly 1 in 12, an improvement built entirely on patient observation rather than any stroke of sudden insight, the kind of grinding, unglamorous mastery that no bard would ever think to sing about, but that had, in the end, kept him alive and building toward something. He also began, in that first year, to experiment with preserving and storing the pearls he found, aware even then that a hoard left carelessly exposed to salt, air, and moisture might tarnish or degrade before he ever found a use for it. He lined the hollow driftwood chest he built for the purpose with dried seaweed and fine sand, a crude but effective method he refined through several failed attempts. An early batch of pearls left wrapped only in damp cloth had developed a faint, troubling discoloration within weeks that taught him, more forcefully than any lecture could have, the value of proper preparation, even in matters that seemed, at first glance, simple. By the end of that first brutal year, he had accumulated 41 ghost pearls, hoarded in a hollowed-out chunk of driftwood buried beneath his sleeping shelter, and he had transformed, in body and in mind, into something his brothers would not have recognized had they somehow, impossibly, sailed close enough to see him. His hands were a ruin of scars and calluses. His body, once soft with royal comfort, had hardened into lean, functional muscle built entirely from the demands of survival. And his mind, which had once occupied itself with court games and the petty jealousies of princes, had narrowed into something colder and far more useful: the patient, calculating focus of a man who understood that every problem, no matter how impossible it looked, eventually yielded to a person willing to fail enough times to learn its shape. The first coin came, as it so often does on forgotten shores, from men who had no business being honest. A smuggling vessel called the Grey Widow, running contraband spice and unregistered weapons along routes designed specifically to avoid the Sea King's patrol ships, was forced by a sudden squall to shelter in the lee of the Widow's Shoals reef, a maneuver its captain, a broad-scarred woman named Isolde Mar, would later admit she'd only attempted because she judged the alternative, riding out the storm in open water, to be marginally more likely to kill her crew. Kestith watched her ship limp into the shallows from his position atop the island's highest rock, weathered and sun-darkened now, utterly unrecognizable as the pale, soft prince who had once stood at royal balls and understood, with the same cold clarity that had let him survive a year of near drownings, that a smuggler forced into hiding by weather was a smuggler who would not linger, and that whatever chance he had to change his circumstances would not present itself twice. He did not swim out to beg for rescue. He waited until the storm passed, and Isolde's crew came ashore to fill their water casks from the island's single fresh water spring, watching them from concealment for the better part of an hour as they worked, noting how they moved, how many carried weapons openly, which among them seemed to hold authority, and which merely followed the same careful, patient study he had once applied to reading tide tables, now turned toward reading people, a skill that would serve him for the rest of his life. Only then did he emerge from the rocks, gaunt and scarred and utterly unafraid, holding a single ghost pearl between two ruined fingers so that the low evening light caught its impossible shifting blue. Isolde Mar had run contraband for 11 years and had seen every kind of desperate man the sea produced, but she had never seen a pearl like that one. And she had certainly never seen a half-drowned castaway negotiate with the flat, unhurried confidence of a man who still believed himself to hold every advantage in the conversation. She turned the pearl over in her calloused fingers for a long moment, testing its weight, holding it up to catch the last of the daylight. And Kestith watched her the entire time with the same patient stillness he had learned to bring to the reef, understanding intuitively that whichever of them spoke first, out of nervousness or eagerness, would lose whatever leveraged silence still afforded them. She spoke first, eventually, demanding to know where he had found it and how many more existed. Kestith told her he had more. He told her the reef that produced them lay nowhere on any chart she carried, that he alone knew which of the thousands of identical-looking oysters actually held a pearl worth the risk of harvesting, and that he was not interested in rescue, only in a trade passage for a portion of his hoard now, and a standing arrangement for future deliveries, paid in the tools, supplies, and eventually the ship's timber that a man rebuilding a life from nothing would require. Isolde laughed at him first, exactly as every hardened traitor in his position would, and told him she could simply take the pearl and leave him to the reef that had already nearly killed him a dozen times over. Kestith reminded her, in the same even tone he would use for the rest of his life, in every negotiation that mattered, that the reef which had nearly killed him would certainly kill any of her crew who tried to harvest it without a year of hard-won knowledge that the currents alone had claimed one of his own attempts, and would show her people no more mercy than they had shown him. He was not threatening her, he clarified, watching her scarred face carefully as he said it. He was simply describing a fact of geography that she was welcome to test at her own crew's expense. It was, he understood even as he said it, a small act of theater. His knowledge of the reef, while genuine, was not quite so absolutely essential as he made it sound. And a sufficiently patient crew could likely have mapped the safe channels themselves given enough time. But Isolde Mar did not have the luxury of patience, not with a hold full of contraband spice slowly spoiling, and a schedule that could not accommodate months of trial-and-error exploration of a reef that had already very nearly wrecked her ship once. The half-truth, delivered with total conviction, was exactly plausible enough to be believed. There was a long silence on that shoreline while Isolde weighed the ragged, unyielding stranger in front of her, her first mate murmuring something low and urgent in her ear that Kestith could not hear, but could easily guess the substance of some argument for simply taking what they wanted and sailing on. The same argument every desperate man on that island had once feared from every ship that passed close enough to notice him. Isolde silenced her first mate with a single sharp gesture, never taking her eyes off Kestith, and Kestith understood, watching that small exchange, that he had won something important in that moment, not the negotiation itself, not yet, but her attention, her willingness to consider him a party worth negotiating with, rather than a problem to be solved with force. She took the deal, and the tools and supplies she left behind, proper knives, cordage, a small cache of preserved food, and crucially, materials to begin building something sturdier than a driftwood shelter, became the foundation of everything that followed. Before she sailed, Isolde offered him one further piece of advice, delivered with the same brusque practicality she brought to everything else, that a man alone on a reef full of treasure was a man one storm or one rival crew away from losing everything he'd built, and that he would do well to find himself some hands he could trust before word of his pearls traveled further than either of them would like. Word of Kestith's steady, reliable pearls traveled slowly through the smuggling underworld over the following 2 years, each new visitor to his shore a potential recruit as much as a customer, and Kestith began deliberately offering shelter and a stake in his growing operation to the kind of men and women the wider world had already discarded: deserters, debtors, escaped indentured laborers, anyone with nowhere left to go and a willingness to work. The first to stay was a former naval diver named Bram, a broad, quiet man who had washed up on a passing trade ship's manifest as a deserter after refusing an order he considered dishonorable, and who possessed, more usefully than any of his other qualities, an instinctive understanding of currents and depth that even Kestith's hard-won year of trial and error could not fully match. Bram did not ask Kestith for his story, and Kestith did not offer it, but the two men developed, over months of diving the reef together, a wordless partnership built on mutual competence that mattered more to both of them than any amount of shared history could have. Bram's first weeks on the reef were their own trial by error, Kestith teaching him the patterns he had learned through a year of near drowning, while Bram, with his professional naval training, contributed refinements Kestith would never have discovered alone: a more efficient hand signal system for communicating underwater, a technique for equalizing pressure in the ears during deep dives that spared them both the agonizing headaches Kestith had simply learned to endure without understanding their cause. Then came Yara, a debtor's daughter sold into indentured service who had slipped her chains during a chaotic dockside fire and stowed away on 3 different ships before finally being put ashore. More out of her host's exhaustion than kindness, near enough to the widow's shoal that she managed to swim the final distance. Yara arrived thin and fever-eyed, having survived on almost nothing during her final desperate swim, and Kestith's first act upon finding her collapsed on the black sand was not negotiation, but simple, unhesitating care, carrying her to shelter. forcing broth made from shellfish and rainwater past her cracked lips, sitting with her through 2 days of delirium in a small unconscious echo of the care Bram and the others would later show him during his own worst moments. Yara turned out to have a sharp mind for organization that Kestith, absorbed as he still often was in the physical demands of the reef, badly needed. And within a year of her arrival, she had transformed his rough tally system into something resembling a proper ledger, tracking pearls harvested, supplies traded, and the growing roster of hands under Kestith's loose but increasingly formalized command. Others followed in the years that stretched afterward, a former shipwright named Cobb. Exiled from his guild after a structural failure in a merchant vessel he had built, was blamed on his craftsmanship rather than on the corrupt inspector who had approved substandard timber. A pair of twin sisters, Lyra and Sael, escaped from a pirate crew that had used them as translators and navigators until they finally seized a moment of chaos to steal a rowboat and vanish into open water. Discovered half-starved and clinging to driftwood by one of Kestith's own early scouting boats, and a grim, silent former soldier named Herrick, whose crime had been refusing to participate in the burning of a rebellious fishing village. A refusal that had cost him his rank, his pension, and very nearly his life before he found his way, by a circuitous route of smaller exiles and betrayals, to the one shore in the known world where a man's past mattered less than his willingness to work. He built his first real structure with the help of 6 such castaways in his operation's 3rd year, a modest stone longhouse that would, within another decade, become the seed of a harbor town that no map acknowledged and every smuggler on 3 seas knew by reputation alone. The construction was its own brutal education. None of them were trained builders, and the longhouse's first attempt collapsed entirely during a minor storm in its 2nd month, forcing them to rebuild from the foundation with a more careful understanding of how the island's volcanic stone needed to be fitted and braced against the coastal wind. Cobb, once his shipwright's instincts reasserted themselves after his own period of grief and adjustment, proved instrumental in that second successful attempt, applying principles of hull construction to stonework in ways that surprised even himself, and the longhouse that finally stood through that year's worst storms became, in a very real sense, the first proof that Kestith's growing community could build something meant to last rather than merely survive. Kestith insisted, even in those earliest days of leadership, on the same principle that would define everything he built afterward, that every hand who worked the reef or raised a wall held a real stake in what they were building, a share of pearls and supplies proportional to their labor, because he remembered too well what it felt like to labor entirely for someone else's benefit, while his own needs went unmet by a family that owed him better. He established, alongside Yara's careful ledgers, a simple but rigorously enforced system of shares, a portion for the individual who found or harvested a given pearl, a portion held in common for the settlement's collective needs, and a small reserve, which Kestith alone controlled in those early years, though he would later cede partial oversight to a council of the settlement's founding members, set aside for exactly the kind of unexpected catastrophe that his own arrival on the island had once represented to him. The first blood came in his 4th year, when a rival smuggling crew, having heard exaggerated rumors of a hidden pearl fortune guarded only by a handful of castaways, attempted to take the reef by force under cover of night. Kestith had known for nearly 2 weeks that trouble was likely coming, a traitor passing through with unusually pointed questions about the exact location of the Widow Shoals safe channel, questions no honest customer had ever needed to ask before, had set alarm bells ringing that Kestith did not ignore. He spent those 2 weeks in careful, quiet preparation, coordinating with Bram and the other hands to identify exactly which sections of the reef could be used to lure an unfamiliar vessel onto submerged rock, and rehearsing, again and again in the dark, the signals and positions that would let a mere handful of defenders repel a much larger force through knowledge of terrain rather than superior numbers. Herrick, drawing on his soldiers' training despite his history of refusing an unjust order, proved invaluable in those preparations, teaching the settlement's less experienced hands how to hold a defensive position without breaking under the noise and chaos of real combat, a discipline none of them, Kestith included, had ever truly been tested against before. Yara, meanwhile, organized the settlement's non-combatants, the two youngest hands who had joined only months earlier, and Cobb, whose skills lay in building rather than fighting, into a support role, preparing bandages and boiled water in the longhouse in case the night went as badly as everyone privately feared it might. He met the raiders when they came, with a coordinated ambush along the treacherous reef passage that only his people knew how to navigate safely in the dark, luring the attacking boats onto submerged rock formations that tore their hulls open in the shallows. The screams of splintering wood carrying across the water as two of the three attacking vessels ran aground within minutes of entering what their crews had believed to be open channel. Kestith and his small defense force finished what the reef started with a controlled, merciless efficiency that left no doubt in anyone's mind that the Widow Shoal was no longer an easy target. He killed a man himself that night, a raider who had managed to swim clear of his wrecked vessel and stumble ashore still armed, and felt, as he had come to expect he would, nothing but the same cold, patient certainty that had carried him through every trial since the cliff. The understanding that mercy shown to an armed enemy on a night like this was simply a debt paid in the blood of his own people who had trusted him enough to build a life on this reef, and a debt he had no intention of paying. Bram took a wound that night, a deep gash along his forearm from a raider's blade that Yara stitched closed by lantern light in the longhouse, while the sounds of the retreating battle still echoed faintly from the shore, and it was watching his friend grit his teeth through that crude field surgery, refusing to make a sound that might alarm the frightened newer hands sheltering nearby, that Kestith first fully understood the weight of what he had built. Not merely an operation for harvesting pearls, but a community of people who had chosen, again and again, to bleed for one another, rather than simply for their own survival. Of the raiding crew, most fled in whatever vessel could still float, carrying word back to whichever smuggling circles had spawned the attempt that the Widow's Shoal was defended by men who knew their own waters better than any outsider ever could. Yara, in the aftermath, suggested and Kestith agreed that the story of that night should be allowed to grow somewhat in the retelling as it spread through the underworld's gossip, a small, deliberate piece of reputation management that cost them nothing and bought them, in the years that followed, a peace they would otherwise have had to fight for again and again. The peace that followed that first battle lasted 3 years, long enough that some of the newer hands who joined the settlement in that stretch never fully believed the stories of that first desperate ambush, treating them the way comfortable people always treat the hardships that built their comfort as legend rather than warning. Kestith did not share their complacency. He had learned, in his years of reading tide tables and reading men, that peace on a reef as valuable as his was never a permanent condition, only an interval. And he spent those 3 quiet years steadily expanding Herrick's defense force, adding a second layer of reef passage traps beyond the one that had wrecked the first raiding crew. And in a decision that cost him considerable private unease, beginning to make careful, deniable inquiries of his own into whether word of the Widow Shoal's pearls had ever reached all the way back to the Salt Throne itself. It had. He learned this in his 9th year of exile, from a nervous trader named Foss, who arrived at the settlement not to buy pearls, but to warn him, in exchange for a favor Kestith had once done him during a lean season, that a merchant house closely tied to the royal court had begun making inquiries in 3 separate ports about a rumored source of pearls unlike any in the known world. Inquiries that had, in the past month, grown considerably less discreet and considerably more insistent. Foss did not know for certain that the inquiries traced back to Roan or Draven directly, but he did know that the merchant house in question held its charter at the pleasure of the crown, and that a charter holder did not spend that kind of coin chasing rumors unless someone considerably more powerful than a merchant had taken a personal interest in the answer. Kestith received this news with the same flat stillness he brought to every piece of difficult information, but Yara, who had come to know him better than almost anyone alive, noticed the particular way his hands stilled entirely on the ledger table when Foss said the words Royal Court, and understood that whatever calm her captain projected, something old and unhealed had just been touched. He thanked Foss, paid him generously, and spent that night alone on the high rock rather than in the longhouse, and none of his people asked him about it the following morning, though all of them noticed. The attack, when it finally came 4 months later, was nothing like the desperate, opportunistic raid of his 4th year. It arrived as 3 proper warships flying no banner at all, a deliberate omission, Kestith understood immediately, meant to preserve deniability for whoever had commissioned them, crewed not by smugglers hoping for an easy score, but by trained naval marines, the kind of disciplined, well-equipped force that only a royal treasury could field. Bram spotted their sails on the horizon 2 full days before they reached the reef, giving Kestith precious time to prepare a defense considerably more sophisticated than the one that had served him against a single ragged raiding crew years before. He gathered his people in the longhouse that first night and told them, plainly and without softening, the truth. Exactly what they faced, and exactly what it would cost to survive it. He offered any who wished to flee the chance to take the second chance and sail for a safer port. No shame attached to the choice, and understood, watching the faces around that firelit room, that he was in some sense reliving his own long-ago moment on the Widow's Shoals, black sand, deciding whether continuing to fight for something was worth the pain of it. Not one person chose to leave. Cobb, in his quiet, practical way, simply asked what needed building before the ships arrived, and that question, more than any speech Kestith could have given, set the tone for the 2 days that followed a settlement of castaways and outcasts choosing, deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost, to stand and fight for the first home most of them had ever actually owned a piece of. Herrick's defense force, expanded and drilled over 3 years of careful preparation, positioned themselves along the reef's hidden channels exactly as they had during the first battle. But this time layered with additional traps, Cobb had spent those same 3 years quietly engineering weighted nets, rigged to foul propellers and rudders, sharpened stakes driven into the shallows at angles calculated to hole a hull below the waterline, and, in the settlement's most audacious innovation, a system of signal mirrors positioned atop the island's highest points that let Bram coordinate the defense with a precision no simple raiding crew could have anticipated. Even so, 3 trained warships crewed by disciplined Marines represented a threat entirely different in scale from anything the Widow's Shoal had faced before, and Kestith knew, standing atop the high rock as the first ship's silhouette grew larger against the dawn horizon, that this battle would not be won as cleanly as the last one had been. The fighting, when it came, stretched across 2 brutal days rather than a single decisive night. The first warship struck the outer reef traps, almost exactly as planned, its hull torn open in the shallows in a scene that might have ended the engagement entirely against a lesser force. But the 2 remaining ships, warned by their sister vessel's fate, slowed their approach and began instead a methodical, patient advance, sending armed longboats ahead to probe for safe channels rather than risking their hulls blindly. Kestith watched this adaptation with a grim, reluctant respect. Whoever commanded this force was neither foolish nor reckless, and the battle that followed would be won, if it was won at all, through discipline and attrition rather than any single clever trick. The longboats that reached the shallows met Herrick's defenders in fighting more brutal and more costly than anything the settlement had yet endured. Kestith fought alongside his people rather than directing from a distance, a decision Yara argued against fiercely beforehand, and that Kestith overruled without much discussion. Understanding that a leader who asked his people to bleed for a reef he watched safely from the rocks was not a leader worth following at all. He took a wound himself in the fighting on the second day, a Marine's blade opening a long gash along his ribs that Yara would later stitch closed with hands that shook, for the first time in years, with something other than exhaustion. 2 of his own people did not survive that second day, a young diver named Pell, who had joined the settlement only the previous winter, cut down defending a channel he had sworn to hold, and Cobb himself, struck by a crossbow bolt while repositioning one of his own weighted nets under fire, dying not instantly, but slowly enough that Kestith reached him in time to hear his last words, a request, delivered with the same dry practicality he had brought to everything else in life, that someone finish reinforcing the eastern seawall before the next storm season, as though even in dying his mind remained fixed on the settlement's continued survival rather than his own end. Kestith carried Cobb's body from the shallows himself, refusing every offer of help from hands who understood, without needing to be told, that this was a grief their captain needed to carry alone, and something in that raw, grinding weight burned away whatever hesitation remained in him. He led the counter-assault against the second longboat wave personally, driving the Marines back into the water with a ferocity that Bram, watching from the signal position, would later describe to Yara as unlike anything he had seen from Kestith before. Not reckless, never reckless, but absolutely without mercy, the cold ballast of 9 years' accumulated anger finally given somewhere to go. The two remaining warships, having lost the better part of 2 landing parties and facing a defense that showed no sign of breaking despite the settlement's own mounting losses, withdrew on the evening of the second day. Their captain, whoever he was, Kestith never learned his name, apparently unwilling to spend more of a Royal Commission's Marines against an island that had already cost him a full third of his force. Kestith watched their sails shrink back toward the horizon from the same high rock where he had watched Isolde Mar's ship arrive so many years before. Blood from his own wound still seeping through Yara's hasty field dressing, and felt none of the triumph he might have expected. He felt, mostly, the specific weight of Cobb's and Pell's names added now to a list he had never wanted to start keeping. They buried their dead on the island's western point, near the seabird colony whose eggs had once kept Kestith alive through his first desperate weeks of exile, and Kestith spoke at both gravesides himself, plainly and without the practiced eloquence his royal upbringing had once trained into him, because he understood that his people did not need beautiful words, only honest ones. He told them that Cobb had built something that would outlast every stone he ever laid with his own hands, and that Pell, barely more than a boy, had died defending a home he had only just begun to call his own, and that neither death would be allowed to mean nothing, because the settlement they had bled for would grow stronger, not smaller, from what this battle had cost them. In the months that followed, as the settlement rebuilt and mourned in equal measure, Kestith made a decision that marked, in later years, the true turning point of his exile. No longer content merely to defend the widow's shoal against whoever came looking for it, he began, deliberately and with Bram's careful navigational help, extending his reach outward into the wider ocean itself, establishing small, discreetly held outposts on 2 further uninhabited islands within a week's sail of his original reef, each one seated with a handful of trusted hands and a portion of the settlement's growing resources, so that no single attack, however well-funded, could ever again threaten to end everything he had built in a single engagement. It was the first true step toward the empire the opening of his story had already promised, the moment a castaway's desperate survival began, consciously and deliberately, to become something considerably larger. The years that followed that first battle brought their own steady accumulation of growth and quiet triumph, each one adding some new layer to what had begun as a single desperate man's survival on a forgotten reef. Cobb, freed from the constant demands of basic construction once the longhouse and its surrounding structures had stabilized, turned his shipwright's expertise toward a project Kestith had been considering since his earliest days trading with Isolde Mar, the construction of a proper vessel of their own, built to their own specifications rather than salvaged or traded piecemeal from smugglers who might at any point decide their arrangement with the widow's shoal was no longer worth the risk. That first ship, a modest single-masted sloop christened, at Yara's insistence and over Kestith's mild protest, the Second Chance, took the better part of a year to build using timber traded carefully across a dozen separate transactions so that no single supplier ever grew suspicious of exactly how much lumber the reclusive castaways of the widow's shoal seemed to require. With the Second Chance came a new phase of Kestith's growing enterprise, no longer merely waiting for smugglers to be blown by chance into his waters, but actively, carefully extending his own reach outward, always through trusted intermediaries in those early years, always with Kestith himself remaining, for reasons of both caution and a lingering wariness of open water he never entirely lost, close to the shores of the widow's shoal itself. Bram, fully recovered from his wound and increasingly confident in his role as the settlement's chief navigator, took command of these early expeditions, expanding their trading contacts to a handful of ports along the kingdom's less watched coastline, always careful to maintain the same principle Kestith had established from his very first negotiation with Isolde Mar, never letting any single trading partner grow to understand the full scope of the Pearl operation, spreading their business thin enough across enough different hands that no one buyer and no one authority those buyers might answer to could ever piece together the whole picture. By his 11th year of exile, the settlement on the Widow's Shoal had grown into a proper harbor town. Its reef passage secrets, known only to those who had earned Kestith's trust, its pearl trade expanded into a broader maritime enterprise that included salvage, shipbuilding, and now a genuine fleet of Kestith's own vessels, crewed by men and women who owed their second chance at life entirely to a castaway prince who had refused to drown. Bram had, by then, trained several dozen new divers across all three of the settlement's holdings in the careful, methodical harvesting techniques Kestith had bled to discover, and Yara's ledgers had grown into a full accounting system tracking trade relationships with more than a dozen separate smuggling captains and, cautiously, now, a handful of legitimate merchant houses who valued reliable pearls over questions about their origin. Each partner kept carefully unaware of how much the others knew. A deliberate strategy of information control that Kestith had adopted early and never abandoned. The settlement had grown, too, in ways that went beyond mere commerce. Lyra and Sail, the twin sisters rescued from piracy, had turned their hard-won knowledge of navigation and foreign tongues into an invaluable resource for negotiating with traders from further-flung ports, and had taken it upon themselves, without any formal instruction from Kestith, to begin teaching basic reading and sums to the settlement's youngest members, for there were children now. Several of them, born to hands who had found in the Widow's Shoal not merely safety, but the beginnings of an actual life worth building a family around. Herrick had been given command of what had, by necessity, become a small but well-drilled defense force, no longer relying solely on the element of surprise that had won the first battle, but backed now by proper weapons. Forged locally by a hand who had once been an apprentice blacksmith before debt forced him into the same desperate wandering that had eventually brought him to Kestith's shore. Kestith himself had changed in ways that extended well beyond the physical transformation of scarred hands and sun-darkened skin. He carried himself now with a settled authority that owed nothing to his birth and everything to 6 years of earned trust, and he had developed, almost without noticing the shift, a habit of consulting Yara, Bram, and increasingly Herrick and Cobb on decisions that in his earlier years he might have made entirely alone, understanding that a settlement built on shared stake and shared sacrifice functioned best when its leadership reflected that same principle. He was 34 years old, and though he rarely spoke of his royal birth even to his closest and most trusted hands, none of them who had watched him negotiate with hardened smugglers or lead a counter-assault against royal marines ever doubted that whatever he had once been, he had become something considerably more formidable in the years since. He stood, that anniversary evening, on the same high rock where he had first watched Isolde Mar's storm battered ship limp toward his reef, looking out over a harbor lit by lantern light, over ships bearing his own growing banner, and thought of his brothers' faces atop the widow's cliff, of his father's rasping order, of the particular arithmetic of betrayal that had thrown away a son and built, in the process, and against every intention, an admiral who would one day command more water than the entire Salt Throne had ever claimed. He thought, too, of Oswin the scribe, dead by his own hand 2 years after the forgery, and felt nothing so simple as satisfaction at that fact. Only the same cold recognition that every act of cruelty eventually collected its own debts, whether or not the collector was ever present to witness the payment. Bram found him there as the evening deepened into full dark, climbing the familiar rock face with the easy confidence of a man who had spent years learning its every handhold, and stood beside him in comfortable silence for a long while before finally asking, in his quiet, unhurried way, whether Kestith ever intended to sail east, back toward the waters of the Salt Throne, now that he commanded ships enough to make the journey safely. Kestith considered the question for a long moment, watching the lantern light flicker across his harbor, before answering that he did not intend to go back, not yet, and not as a beggar seeking to reclaim what had been stolen from him. When he finally sailed east, he told Bram it would not be to ask his brothers for anything at all. It would be because the entire ocean between the Widow's Shoal and the Salt Throne had by then learned to answer to his banner first. Yara joined them on the rock a short while later, drawn by some instinct for the significance of the evening, and the three of them stood together in silence, watching the harbor's lantern-lit ships rock gently at anchor below, watching smoke curl upward from a dozen chimneys that had not existed 6 years earlier, watching, in the far distance where the black water met the darkening horizon, the faint suggestion of a world that had once thrown Kesteth Vale away as worthless, and would, in time, be forced to reckon with exactly what it had discarded. The Empire was not yet built. It was, on that evening, still only a hidden harbor and a fleet of a dozen ships, still small enough, still young enough, that a determined enemy with sufficient resources and sufficient patience might yet threaten to unmake it before it ever grew large enough to challenge the throne that had condemned him. But Kesteth Vale stood over it, with the stillness of a man already counting a very different kind of debt, one measured not in pearls harvested or ships built, but in every silence, every cruelty, every casual assumption his brothers had made about how quietly he would drown in the widow's maw. He thought of Draven's almost gentle voice atop the cliff, and felt no anger anymore, only a cold, patient certainty. The same certainty that had let him negotiate with an armed smuggler over a single pearl. The same certainty that had let him drive a blade into a raider's chest without flinching. The same certainty that had let him bury nothing of his own grief so deep that it could not still be measured, carefully and precisely, against a debt that had not yet come due. Somewhere across the water, on a throne built from a lie and a brother's cruelty, that debt was quietly, patiently, coming due in Kesteth Vale, once thrown from a cliff with his hands bound and left for the sea to judge, intended to make absolutely certain that when the reckoning finally arrived, it would not come as a beggar's plea, but as the entire ocean itself, arriving all at once, exactly as his brothers had once wished the sea would swallow him whole.